A single misunderstanding shattered everything Jimin and Jungkook had spent years protecting. Before anyone could uncover the truth, Jimin disappeared into the pouring rain, carrying a heartbreak no one else could see. As Jungkook realized that every painful accusation had been built on a devastating mistake, panic replaced pride, and regret became impossible to escape. Friends searched in every direction while hidden sacrifices and buried secrets quietly surfaced, revealing that someone had been suffering in silence all along. But when Jungkook finally caught sight of Jimin standing at the edge of a life-changing decision, one terrifying question remained. Was he already too late to save the person he could never bear to lose? Jimin and Jungkook had always shared a connection that seemed impossible to explain with simple words. To everyone around them, they appeared inseparable, moving through demanding schedules, exhausting rehearsals, and quiet moments with an effortless understanding that had been built over years of trust. RM often admired the calm balance they created for each other, while Jin joked that neither of them ever needed to finish a sentence because the other already understood. Sugar noticed the silent loyalty hidden beneath their smiles, J-Hope treasured the warmth they brought into every room, and Taehyung quietly believed that no misunderstanding could ever be strong enough to separate them. Their friendship had become something everyone relied upon, a constant source of comfort even during the most exhausting days. Yet beneath that comforting routine, invisible cracks had already begun to spread. Jimin carried a growing emotional burden that he refused to share, convincing himself that protecting everyone else mattered more than revealing his own pain. The trust that had protected their bond for years began cracking under the weight of assumptions. Meanwhile, Jimin never noticed Jungkook watching from the shadows. His attention remained fixed on the difficult reality he was struggling to face. The documents in his hands represented decisions that could change everything. The future he had carefully imagined suddenly felt uncertain, and every attempt to protect the people he loved seemed to be creating even greater problems. As he left the building that night, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside him. Something felt wrong. The world around him appeared unchanged, yet his heart carried a strange sense of approaching disaster. Across the city, Jungkook sat alone replaying the scene over and over again. Each memory became more painful than the last. Each interpretation seemed more convincing. By midnight, disappointment had transformed into anger. By morning, anger had transformed into heartbreak. And somewhere between those emotions, the foundation of their relationship quietly began to collapse. Neither of them realized that the next encounter would push everything beyond the point of no return. Because the misunderstanding was no longer growing in silence. It was preparing to explode. Morning arrived with an uneasy stillness that seemed to follow everyone into the practice studio. The familiar energy that usually filled the room had vanished, replaced by cautious glances and forced smiles. Jimin greeted everyone with the same gentle warmth he always tried to offer, but the exhaustion in his eyes was impossible to hide. He had barely slept, spending the entire night wrestling with decisions that felt heavier than ever. The envelope remained tucked safely inside his bag, untouched since the previous evening, yet its presence alone felt like a constant reminder that time was running out. Jungkook entered moments later, carrying a completely different burden. His heart had not found peace overnight. Instead, every memory of what he had witnessed had hardened into something that felt dangerously close to certainty. The rational part of him wanted to believe there had to be another explanation, but wounded emotions refused to listen. Every time his eyes met Jimin's, he instinctively looked away, afraid that even a single glance might expose the confusion raging inside him. The others immediately sensed the invisible wall standing between them. RM paused in the middle of organizing the day's schedule, quietly observing both of them with growing concern. Jin attempted to lighten the atmosphere with his usual humor, but the laughter that followed sounded hollow. Sugar watched silently from the corner, recognizing that the room was carrying the kind of silence that often appeared before everything fell apart. J-Hope tried encouraging everyone through practice, hoping movement would distract them from whatever had settled between Jimin and Jungkook. Taehyung, however, noticed something else entirely. He recognized the pain in both of their expressions and realized that whatever misunderstanding had been quietly growing was now becoming impossible to ignore. As rehearsals continued, even the smallest mistakes carried unusual weight. A missed step, an absent-minded movement, a delayed reaction, ordinary imperfections suddenly felt symbolic of something much deeper. Jimin struggled to maintain his concentration as dizziness briefly clouded his vision, forcing him to steady himself before anyone noticed. He quickly recovered, pretending nothing had happened, determined to protect everyone from worrying about him. Unfortunately, Jungkook witnessed only that brief moment of weakness before seeing Jimin quietly reassure Taehyung moments later. Once again, the truth slipped further out of reach. Inside Jungkook, regret and resentment battled each other without a clear winner. Part of him wanted to walk across the room and ask the questions that had haunted him for days. Another part feared hearing answers that would destroy what remained of their bond forever. His silence became its own prison, locking away every feeling until they began transforming into quiet frustration. Jimin, unaware of the storm unfolding in Jungkook's heart, interpreted the distance as disappointment in him. Believing he had already become a burden, he withdrew even further, convinced that keeping his struggles hidden was still the kindest choice. By the end of the day, both of them stood only a few steps apart, yet emotionally they had never felt farther away. Neither realized that someone else had been watching the growing divide with increasing alarm. Hidden among ordinary routines, a single overlooked detail connected to the envelope was about to surface, one that could either expose the truth or make the misunderstanding irreversible. And when that secret finally emerged, Jungkook would be forced to confront the terrifying possibility that he had been chasing the wrong conclusion from the very beginning. That overlooked detail surfaced in the most unexpected way. As everyone prepared to leave, a stack of papers slipped from Jimin's bag onto the studio floor. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it immediately drew everyone's attention. Before Jimin could react, a gust of air from the open doorway scattered several pages across the room. His expression changed instantly. The calm composure he had maintained for weeks disappeared, replaced by genuine panic. Without thinking, Jungkook instinctively stepped forward to help gather the papers. For one brief moment, his concern overpowered every doubt he had been carrying. But before he could reach the nearest page, Jimin hurried between him and the scattered documents, collecting them with trembling hands. His movements were desperate, almost fearful, as though allowing anyone to read even a single sentence would destroy everything he had tried so hard to protect. To Jimin, it was an act of protection. To Jungkook, it looked like another painful confirmation that he was no longer trusted. The distance between them widened once again. Taehyung quickly knelt beside Jimin, helping him gather the remaining pages before anyone else could see them. RM frowned, sensing that whatever those papers contained was far more serious than anyone realized. Jin's smile completely faded as he watched Jimin's shaking hands. Sugar quietly lowered his eyes, recognizing fear rather than guilt in Jimin's expression. J-Hope stood frozen, unable to understand why everyone suddenly seemed trapped inside emotions too heavy to describe. No one noticed that one page had drifted beneath a nearby chair. No one except Sugar. After everyone finally left the studio, Sugar quietly retrieved the forgotten sheet. He had no intention of invading Jimin's privacy, but one glance at the document was enough to make his expression harden with concern. It wasn't evidence of betrayal. It wasn't a secret relationship. It wasn't anything Jungkook had imagined. It was part of a confidential medical evaluation. Several sections had been blacked out, while others referred to ongoing examinations and urgent follow-up appointments. The details were incomplete, but one thing was painfully clear: Jimin had been facing something serious completely alone. Sugar carefully folded the page, his heart sinking. Suddenly, every strange behavior, every forced smile, every unexplained absence, and every exhausted expression made heartbreaking sense. He immediately understood why Jimin had desperately tried to keep the documents hidden. He also understood something even more frightening. If Jungkook continued believing the misunderstanding that had consumed him, he might unknowingly inflict the deepest wound Jimin had ever experienced. Meanwhile, neither Jimin nor Jungkook knew that the first piece of the truth had finally surfaced. Jimin walked through the city alone beneath darkening skies, convinced that he had managed to keep his secret safe for one more day. Yet the emotional burden had become almost unbearable. Every step felt heavier than the last, and every passing streetlight reminded him how isolated he had become inside his own silence. Not far behind, Jungkook made a decision that would change everything. Unable to endure another night of unanswered questions, he resolved that the next time he saw Jimin, he would finally force the truth into the open, no matter how painful it might be. He believed he was preparing for the end of their friendship. He had no idea he was actually walking toward the greatest regret of his life. The following evening arrived beneath a sky heavy with dark clouds, as though the weather itself sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. Jimin left the building earlier than usual, hoping to avoid everyone's questions and give himself time to think before his next medical appointment. His steps were slow, weighed down not only by physical exhaustion but also by the crushing guilt of believing that his silence had hurt the people he cared about most. He never imagined that only a short distance behind him, Jungkook had already begun following him, determined to end the uncertainty that had consumed his heart for weeks. At first, Jungkook kept his distance, watching Jimin disappear through crowded streets with an expression he could barely recognize. There was no sign of deception in Jimin's movements. Instead, there was only fatigue, hesitation, and a loneliness so profound that it unsettled him. For the first time, the certainty he had built from assumptions began to weaken. The image of betrayal that had haunted him suddenly seemed incomplete, yet pride and confusion still prevented him from calling out. Meanwhile, back at the studio, Sugar quietly showed the forgotten medical document to RM. Both of them stood in stunned silence as they pieced together what little information the page revealed. The details were fragmented, but they were enough to understand that Jimin had been carrying an overwhelming burden completely alone. RM immediately realized the dangerous misunderstanding that had been growing between the two closest people in the group. His expression tightened with urgency as he reached for his phone, trying to contact both Jimin and Jungkook. Neither answered. Jin and J-Hope quickly sensed that something serious had happened, while Taehyung's face turned pale the moment Sugar explained where the document had come from. Guilt washed over him almost instantly. He remembered every moment he had tried to quietly support Jimin, never realizing that those same moments had been witnessed from a completely different perspective. What he believed had been an act of kindness had unintentionally become the very spark that ignited the misunderstanding. Across the city, the first drops of rain began to fall. Jimin stopped beneath a streetlight, closing his eyes as the cool rain touched his face. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to breathe without pretending to be strong. The weight he had carried in silence threatened to overwhelm him, and his shoulders trembled beneath the growing storm. Hidden just beyond the corner, Jungkook witnessed that quiet moment. There was no performance, no secrecy, no sign of betrayal, only someone fighting a battle alone. A painful realization began forming inside him. What if he had misunderstood everything? Before he could step forward, Jimin suddenly continued walking toward a brightly lit medical center at the end of the street. Jungkook froze where he stood. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as countless memories rushed back at once. The envelope, the hidden papers, the exhaustion, the trembling hands, the forced smiles. One by one, every moment he had interpreted as betrayal began rearranging itself into something far more heartbreaking. Just then, His phone vibrated. It was RM. The message contained only a few urgent words, but they struck harder than anything Jungkook had ever experienced. The truth wasn't what he thought. And by the time Jungkook lifted his eyes from the screen, Jimin had already disappeared through the doors of the medical center, leaving him standing alone in the rain, terrified that every step he had taken over the past weeks had led him away from the person who had needed him most. Jungkook stood motionless as the rain poured harder, his eyes fixed on the glowing entrance of the medical center. For several long seconds, he could not force himself to move. Every accusation he had silently nurtured, every bitter conclusion he had accepted, and every cold glance he had directed toward Jimin returned to him with crushing force. The certainty that had once fueled his anger dissolved into overwhelming guilt. He finally understood that he had never searched for the truth. He had searched for evidence that matched his fears, and in doing so, he had failed to see the quiet pain that had been unfolding right in front of him. Inside the building, Jimin sat alone in a quiet waiting area beneath bright white lights that made the room feel even colder. His hands rested tightly around the now worn envelope, its edges bent from weeks of anxious handling. His body appeared calm, but every slow breath revealed the exhaustion he had fought so hard to conceal. He was no longer thinking about protecting himself. His greatest fear had become the possibility that his silence had permanently damaged the bond he treasured most. Even if the truth eventually came to light, he wondered whether trust could ever be rebuilt after so much distance and misunderstanding. Outside, Jungkook finally gathered enough courage to step through the automatic doors. Every footstep echoed through the nearly empty hallway, each one carrying the weight of regret. He searched every corridor with growing desperation, his heart pounding harder each time he turned another corner. The sterile scent of the hospital, the quiet hum of distant machines, and the solemn expressions of strangers waiting for loved ones all deepened the realization that Jimin had been facing something far more serious than he had ever imagined. At that same moment, RM, Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung rushed toward the medical center after finally reaching the location through staff records. None of them spoke much during the journey. The silence inside the vehicle reflected the fear each of them carried. RM blamed himself for not noticing the warning signs sooner. Jin replayed every cheerful joke he had made, wondering how many times Jimin had smiled just to avoid worrying everyone. J-Hope struggled to hold on to hope, refusing to believe they were too late to repair the damage. Sugar remained quietly focused, knowing that the greatest wound between Jimin and Jungkook had never been caused by hatred, but by silence. Taehyung carried the heaviest burden of all, believing that his attempts to protect Jimin had unintentionally widened the distance between two people who had always trusted each other. As Jungkook reached the end of another hallway, he caught sight of a familiar figure through a partially open doorway. Jimin stood alone beside a rain-covered window, staring into the night with an expression of quiet acceptance that Jungkook had never seen before. The envelope rested against his chest, as though it contained not just medical papers, but every unspoken emotion he had carried alone. Jungkook's breath caught in his throat. The distance between them was only a few meters, yet it felt greater than every mile he had crossed searching for answers. For the first time since the misunderstanding began, there were no assumptions left, only the painful certainty that the truth was finally within reach. But whether that truth would heal their broken bond or reveal a sacrifice far greater than anyone had imagined remained heartbreakingly uncertain. The moment both of them had unknowingly feared for weeks had finally arrived, and neither of their lives would ever be the same after what was about to be revealed. Jimin slowly lowered his gaze from the rain-streaked window, unaware that only a few steps behind him Jungkook stood frozen beneath the dim corridor lights. The silence between them felt heavier than any words ever could. Weeks of misunderstanding, loneliness, and quiet suffering had condensed into a single fragile moment that neither of them had been prepared to face. Even without turning around, Jimin sensed a familiar presence. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, not from fear, but from the heartbreaking realization that the moment he had tried to postpone for so long had finally arrived. Before either of them could move, the door at the end of the hallway opened. A medical staff member emerged carrying a thin folder identical to the envelope Jimin had protected so desperately. The staff member scanned the hallway before respectfully approaching Jimin. Jungkook instinctively stepped back into the shadows, unable to tear his eyes away. What followed lasted only a few seconds, yet every movement carried enormous emotional weight. The folder was returned to Jimin together with several additional documents marked for immediate follow-up. There was no sign of secrecy born from betrayal, only the unmistakable gravity of a personal struggle that demanded courage no one should have to face alone. At that exact moment, RM, Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung reached the end of the corridor. They stopped the instant they saw Jimin standing with the folder pressed tightly against his chest and Jungkook silently watching from a distance. No one interrupted. The atmosphere itself seemed to ask for patience. RM immediately understood that this was not a moment to solve with advice. It was a moment that required truth to reveal itself naturally. Jin lowered his head, overcome by the painful realization that someone who had always comforted others had been carrying unbearable anxiety in complete silence. J-Hope's hopeful expression faded into quiet concern, while Sugar closed his eyes briefly, wishing they had all recognized the warning sign sooner. Taehyung remained completely still, his heart weighed down by guilt, knowing that every attempt he had made to quietly protect Jimin had unintentionally deepened the misunderstanding. Jimin finally turned around. His tired eyes met Jungkook's. There was no anger. No accusation. Only exhaustion, sadness, and the silent question of whether the bond they had spent years building could survive everything that had happened. The sight struck Jungkook harder than any accusation ever could. The person standing before him was not someone hiding betrayal. He was someone who had been fighting alone while desperately trying to keep everyone else from suffering alongside him. Every cold glance Jungkook had given him, every unanswered opportunity to simply ask what was wrong, returned with crushing force. Regret settled deep inside his heart until it became almost impossible to breathe. Jimin's grip on the folder slowly loosened. Several pages slipped free, drifting gently onto the polished hospital floor. This time, no one rushed to hide them. The top page landed only a short distance from Jungkook's feet. His eyes fell upon it instinctively. He did not need to read every line. The bold medical heading, the specialist referrals, and the repeated notes about ongoing examinations were enough to shatter the final pieces of the misunderstanding. In that instant, the entire truth began collapsing over him like a wave. Everything he had believed. Everything he had feared. Everything he had silently blamed Jimin for. None of it had been real. Instead, Jimin had been carrying a painful burden alone, convinced that protecting everyone else mattered more than asking for help. Jungkook felt the world around him blur as overwhelming guilt replaced every lingering doubt. For the first time since this heartbreaking journey began, he understood that the person he had been desperately chasing was never running away from him. Jimin had been running toward a battle he believed he had to face alone. And realizing that devastating truth would force Jungkook to make the most important choice of his life. Jungkook could no longer remain where he stood. The invisible wall built from fear, pride, and misunderstanding finally crumbled beneath the unbearable weight of the truth. Every step he took toward Jimin felt heavier than the last, as though he were walking through the consequences of every assumption he had made. The hospital corridor remained completely silent. Even RM, Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung instinctively stayed back, understanding that this was no longer a moment anyone else could resolve. Jimin looked down at the scattered documents before slowly lifting his eyes again. His face revealed weeks of emotional exhaustion. The strength he had forced himself to carry for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by the quiet vulnerability he had hidden from everyone. He had never wanted this truth to emerge in a hallway beneath bright hospital lights. He had imagined finding the right time, the right words, and the right moment to explain everything. Instead, fate had stripped away every opportunity to prepare. Jungkook's heart ached as he replayed every painful memory through an entirely different perspective. Jimin leaving rehearsals early had never been an attempt to avoid him. The secret phone calls had been reminders of appointments and examinations. The hidden envelope had never contained betrayal, but hope, fear, and uncertainty. Taehyung's quiet support had not been the beginning of another relationship. It had been the kindness of a friend protecting someone who was too afraid to burden the people he loved most. Every misunderstanding transformed into a painful truth. Every suspicion became another reason to regret his silence. Across the hallway, Taehyung lowered his head, still blaming himself for unknowingly becoming part of the misunderstanding. Sugar quietly rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder, silently reminding him that guilt alone could not change what had happened. Watched the two people who had always found strength in each other now standing on opposite sides of a wound neither had intended to create. Jin's eyes glistened as he realized how fragile even the strongest relationships could become when fear replaced honesty. J-Hope could only hope that the bond they had all admired for years had not been broken beyond repair. Jimin's breathing became noticeably uneven. The emotional strain of weeks spent carrying everything alone had finally caught up with him. His shoulders trembled slightly as he bent to collect the remaining papers. Before he could reach them, Jungkook quietly knelt and gathered each page with extraordinary care. This time there was no suspicion, no desperate search for answers, and no fear of discovering another secret. There was only deep remorse for failing to notice the silent pain hidden behind Jimin's gentle smiles. As Jungkook carefully placed the documents back into the worn envelope, he realized something that would stay with him forever. Trust is not only tested by the truth people reveal. It is tested by the patience to seek understanding before believing the worst. That realization pierced his heart more deeply than any accusation ever could. Outside, the rain that had pounded relentlessly against the windows finally began to soften. The storm that had mirrored their emotional turmoil slowly lost its fury, leaving only quiet drops sliding down the glass. It felt as though the world itself had paused, waiting to see whether two hearts separated by misunderstanding could still find their way back to each other. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. The medical journey ahead remained uncertain, and the emotional wounds would not disappear overnight. But for the first time in weeks, the silence between them no longer felt like a prison built from fear. It felt like the fragile beginning of healing. And although forgiveness would take time, Jungkook silently vowed that Jimin would never again have to carry such a heavy burden alone, no matter how difficult the road ahead became. Their greatest challenge was no longer uncovering the truth. It was proving that even after the deepest misunderstanding, trust, loyalty, and love could still survive. The weeks that followed were far from easy. The truth had ended the misunderstanding, but it could not erase the pain it had created. Trust, once shaken, required patience to rebuild. Every hospital visit, every rehearsal, and every quiet evening became another opportunity to replace regret with understanding. Jimin gradually allowed the people around him to share the burden he had carried alone for so long. Carefully adjusted schedules whenever he sensed Jimin needed rest. Jin made sure no one ever faced difficult days in isolation. Sugar remained the steady presence who listened without demanding explanations. J-Hope filled the heavy moments with quiet optimism, reminding everyone that hope often appeared after the darkest nights. Taehyung finally released the guilt he had been carrying, realizing that true friendship was not measured by perfection but by the willingness to stand beside someone when everything fell apart. Jungkook changed more than anyone. The experience left a permanent mark on his heart. He became more attentive to the emotions hidden behind silence, no longer assuming that someone who smiled was free from pain.